Good morning, everyone. I want to talk about what it means to be an anxiety superhero. I know that concept when you just say the word. I'm trying to think of associating yourself as a superhero sounds pretty arrogant. Um, but uh, but the reason that's important, especially for when you're looking at something that is limiting or problematic for you, like something like anxiety, it's at least in my experience and the way that I've experienced it, it's been incredibly liberating and incredibly empowering to consider this ailment that I've had, this thing that's been with me for so long, as a superpower. And in fact, I'm even wearing my favorite superhero shirt right now. Aquaman was pretty underrated, if you ask me. But so let's talk about the anxiety superhero and how to reframe something like anxiety into a superpower. Well, I think a lot of it comes from the fact that is how we look at ourselves. When we experience anxiety or when we're experiencing fear or depression or something like that, are we considering ourselves victims or are we considering ourselves victors? Most of the time, we're thinking of ourselves as victims because something is affecting us that we don't want to affect us. We're feeling a feeling that we don't want to feel. And so we take the victim route. We we shrink inward instead of doing what we need to do, which is to push outward beyond what we're looking at and ask ourselves what these feelings actually mean. So, in my history, going back to my 20s, when I first started experiencing anxiety, I didn't know what I was feeling. I didn't know what this was. I didn't know there was such a thing as an anxiety disorder. I grew up as a teenager. Yeah, I was a bit of a worrier, but for the most part, I was just as confident as any other teenager out there. And so it hit me like a ton of bricks when I was, about 20 years old. I I thought to I was studying for an exam in college, and suddenly I was just hit with a ton of bricks with this panic attack, and I fell to the floor basically just uh, in this paralyzing fear that I didn't know where it was coming from, but there was so much certainty in my head about this fear, and I knew that it was so irrational, but it was so real in my head. And then it proceeded to affect me for the rest of my 20s and into my 30s until I actually started to work with it because I didn't know what it was. I thought I was crazy, and I didn't know how to manage it. So when I started to get a better handle on it, ultimately when I found sobriety after getting sober, I learned so many valuable things within sobriety about how to manage life and how to look at things in a new perspective, that I realized I could probably do the same thing with anxiety itself and these fears that I was feeling. Yes, um, the bad feelings, the butterflies in the stomach, the head continuing to go and go around, continue to happen, and they're not pleasant. But there's also some side effects that are really great and that we can use to our advantage. I mean, you think about somebody who experiences anxiety, at least for myself, I recognize that I am a hypersensitive person. When I look into things, I tend to dig deep and I tend to see a lot of meaning behind things that may not be true and some that may be. But I'm really sensitive to things that are around me. I'm sensitive how other people are feeling, how the room feels. There's a bit of an empathic kind of feeling there. I'm sensitive to I'm very self-aware. I'm very aware of how my position in the world affects other people. Does anybody else kind of feel that way? Does anybody else experience that kind of thing? Ultimately, anxiety is something that just magnifies our existing feelings. It's expressed as anxiety because it magnifies our fear. So our emotions are ultimately magnified in a lot of ways. So how can that be a good thing? Well, think about the sensitivity for a moment, to use that as an example. Well, if I'm a hypersensitive person, yes, that can be a bad thing that affects me negatively. I can feel the room and get exhausted by feeling people's emotions or feeling like I've offended somebody when I really haven't, or feeling like I might be in some way socially awkward. Um, but I also may be sensitive to how I can help people, or how other people, if I'm sensitive to how other people may be feeling, I may be sensitive to reach out, or I may be more self-aware so that I know how I can better be of service in this world. How can those negative traits of anxiety be a superpower for you? I think that there's a lot of ways that that can. Another one of mine that I'll talk about, and maybe you have this as well, but I can only share my experience. It's really up to everybody else or you to decide what what the negative feelings you have are and how to reframe it as a superpower. But another thing that I have is a very obsessive personality. It's what it's what kind of drove my alcoholism for a long time. It's what addicted me to cigarettes. It's what makes me want to look at Facebook for hours on end and just and just absorb that. I have a very obsessive personality, but that's also how I get into an obsessive focus on training for triathlon and going in that direction. It's a balance. I mean, of course, obsession can be a very, very, very bad thing, and it can affect us very poorly if it's not productive. But it can also be a very good thing when we can obsess and use that in a productive way. So there's ways in which we can turn these limitations, these perceived limitations that we have, into superpowers. And it is pretty amazing when you can reframe it that way. So how can we really reframe our mind when we're perceiving that our mind is working against us? Well, the first step really is to recognize that our minds aren't necessarily working against us. Again, it's magnifying these certain emotions and these certain things. So once we know that it's just being magnified, and there's this monster in our head that really can't hurt us, it can't it can't do anything bad to us, it can just make us think thoughts that we don't want to think, or feel certain ways that we don't want to feel. Well, then we can just take a deep breath, and then we can start to breathe, and we can just start to ask ourselves questions, or start asking ourselves the why. Why am I feeling this way? Why this? And then get down to a really deep level of why, to find out what you can do to overcome that negative emotion, and then ask yourself, how can I turn this into a positive? How can I reframe this into a positive emotion that will help drive me forward? Because there really are two options when it comes to anxiety, and a lot of them are outside of our control because we live with this thing. We can do certain things to minimize the effect anxiety has on us. We could change our diet into something that is healthy. We can go out and exercise, and we've talked about those sorts of things. We can seek therapy, which is highly encouraged if you're going through this. Talking this through with someone is very, very wise when you're having anxiety or depression. And you can meditate. You can do all these active things to try to minimize the effect of it. It's still with us. So given that it is a part of us, how can we embrace it? How can we turn it into something? When we do everything we can to govern the level of its effect on us, how can we now, once we have that manageability over it, how can we turn it into something positive? And I can speak from my experience that when we seek the positives in it, we do find these incredible superpowers. Behind every limitation that we have, there is a superpower. It's like Newton's law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. For every negative symptom of anxiety, there is a positive. And you can reframe that. And we see it all the time, and it's really about attitude and how we do that. So ultimately, while it's difficult, and I'm not saying that any of this is easy, but while it is difficult, it is real, and you can reframe the negative symptoms into a positive. You can become a victor rather than a victim, and that is really your choice. Are you going to give into the story of being a victim, or are you going to create an empowering story that can move you beyond it? So, saying to yourself that you have superpowers is not arrogant at all, especially when you're doing it in a way that that shrinks down those limitations that exist in your head, that that seek to destroy that anxiety and put it and squish it down. When we can turn that into a positive, when we can turn that into a superpower, then we're truly living a fulfilling life, and it'll change your life. I guarantee it. So while the concept of an anxiety superhero or being that is seems kind of silly or arrogant or what have you, it's not. It's very empowering, and find your own superpower. Become your own superhero, and whatever limits you, look for the positive in it. Look for how you can become empowered. Have a great day, my friends, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks.